The Sega Saturn is kind of a strange console. It took a distant third in the war between PlayStation 1 and N64, so there aren't a ton of great North American releases for it. So that's why in 1998, as a poor college student, I only had a PlayStation. We held impromptu Tekken 3 tournaments almost daily. I kicked ass, but in retrospect, we were all a bunch of drunks and potheads, so, who knows? So, what's the point of all this? Well, the point is that I had no use for a Sega Saturn in 1998. So when the RD of my dorm came knocking at my door asking if I wanted his Sega Saturn for free, I didn't really care. Don't get me wrong, I said yes, but on a shoestring college budget, I didn't have any grand aspirations to build a Saturn game collection. But even back then, I was a hardcore gamer, so within a few days, I managed to find myself a ride to the nearest Funko Land, if you remember what those are. Now, I hadn't actually planned on spending any money, but when I walked in, I immediately saw Sonic Jam, Shining Force 3, and Panzer Dragoon Saga, all complete, all like new, and all of them, grand total, under $90. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. I wish I could say that I still had the very same copy I bought that day, but my life has had its ups and downs, as most people's have, and all I can say is that I hope I never have to sell it again, because in truth, this is still such a great game. Last week, I harped on Die Hard Arcade for having some pretty lousy graphics, so I fully expected Panzer Dragoon Saga to look way worse than I remembered. But strangely, it has the same visual appeal it had back in 1998. Sure, the CG cutscenes are low res and there's short draw distance and pop in like everywhere, but the art direction and vibrant color palette just scream Panzer Dragoon, and that really works for me. This is probably the best looking 3D game for a console much better known for its 2D graphics. This game is stranded on the Sega Saturn. There's no other version of it anywhere else, and so I've often wondered if I'd even want an HD remake of this, out of fear that it might lose some of that late 90s low polygon, low res charm. I'm sure somebody could do it right, but when's the last time Sega really did anything right? The controls are uniquely 90s too. It takes some time to relearn how to navigate 3D spaces with a D-pad, but it takes even longer to get used to the cursor that Saga uses to interact with items. Oddly, the cursor's vertical movement will also be inverted if you invert your Dragon's flight controls, so my recommendation is just to opt out of inverted controls entirely, and just try to get used to it. It'll be worth your time. For an RPG in the late 90s, this game is actually ridiculously short, clocking in at around 18 to 20 hours, which is practically nothing compared to almost every Squaresoft game released on PlayStation 1. But this doesn't ever feel like a traditional RPG. Yeah, there are random battles and magic and NPCs and every other trope you can think of. But it's a shooter that feels like an adventure that's wrapped in the guise of an RPG. And try as I might, I can't think of another game in the 32 or 64-bit generations that play even remotely similar to this. Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2 are about as close as it gets, and those aren't even in the same genre. It's hard to explain, but Panzer Dragoon Saga feels more like an adventure than an RPG. One of the RPG conventions that Saga doesn't shake, though, are random battles. And there are points when you're trying to explore the larger maps, when they just sort of get in the way, disrupting the flow of whatever it is you're trying to do. But it doesn't take long to discover that the battles here are half the fun. Being that all fights take place on Dragonback, you'll constantly be circling around your enemies, jockeying for position, looking for weak spots, and staying out of attack range. Think of it like active time battles, but add the strategic element of character placements on the battlefield, without ever feeling like a strategy RPG. I said on a podcast once that I was scared to play Panzer Dragoon Saga again, that all the nostalgia would be ruined and the fond memories I had of the game would be tarnished by my 2016 perspective. And I'm happy to say that this isn't the case. Well, not entirely. I do have some complaints. First, there are moments when Saga just looks awful, and it's almost entirely during cutscenes that use the in-game engine. It's a real shame, because otherwise the game looks great with day-night cycles and some really great variety in the environments. Secondly, the world of Panzer Dragoon Saga just isn't very big. There's just a handful of locations, despite being a 4-disc game, so if you're ever waiting for the world map to blow wide open, it never does. And finally, the underground ruins of Yuru. It's a whole section of the game, but it's awful. It's a maze, and it sucks, and I hated wasting hours of my life wandering aimlessly through it. Do yourself a favor, use a guide, and get past this area as quickly as possible so it doesn't ruin your experience like it almost ruined mine. Panzer Dragoon Saga proves, along with Astal, Burning Rangers, and Dark Savior, that the Sega Saturn outside of Japan isn't totally without merit. In fact, if you're building a North American Saturn collection, be sure to track this one down.